Hello, I am Jean-Marc Coicot, the Director of the Division of Global Affairs at Rutgers University, and today with us we have Mr. János Pastor, who is Assistant Secretary General on Climate Change for the UN. János, thank you for being here with us today. Thank you for taking the time to be here. And so since we are in the immediate aftermath of the COP21, and since you have been overseeing or assisting the Secretary General on issues of climate change, maybe we would want to have this conversation focusing on three issues: the road to COP21, COP21 itself, which took place a few weeks ago in Paris, and then the implementation of COP21. Mm-hmm. So why don't we begin with the road to COP21? You have been working on climate change issues for many years. It has been a difficult path. So can you tell us about the preparation of COP21?
Okay, so basically COP21 came out of almost, you could say, 9 years of negotiations, 9 years of preparations. It started at the Bali Conference of the Parties in 2007. But it really accelerated and became what it became in the last year. So I will focus on this last year, but I think it is important to say that there is many years of hard work behind this agreement. So what happened here?
And COP21 stands for what?
COP is the Conference of the Parties, and 21 refers to the 21st meeting of the Conference of the Parties. Mm-hmm. So that's it meets once a year, so you can count for how many years it has been in place.
Okay, a lot of work.
A lot of work, yes, indeed. So the conference in Paris, every COP is invited by a host country, or it happens at the location of the Secretariat, but it's usually invited by a country, a host country. And this year it was France who was the host, and it's the host that usually provides also the president of the COP. So they have the political leadership, and they have also the practical organizational responsibility together with the Secretariat of the convention that is based in Bonn, Germany. Now, what has happened over the course of the year, the previous COP president was Peru. Mm-hmm. So this is then handed over to France over the course of the year, and there is a kind of a balance where initially it's the Peruvians in charge, and then slowly, step by step, they hand over to the French. Formally, the next president only becomes president at the beginning of that Conference of the Parties that they organize. But in reality, this is a shift over a long period of time. And what has happened is that the French have done a remarkable job in preparing the groundwork, doing technical workshops, and then most importantly doing the diplomatic work and bringing together informal discussions of ministers and the technical people, which then together prepare the ground for the actual negotiation.
So we have had prior to COP21 20 COPs. Mm-hmm. So why was it decided, or was it decided that this event in Paris in late November, early December, why was it decided that it should be a landmark event? Why was it supposed to be a so important event?
Because it was already agreed a few years before that in Durban that by this year countries will come to an agreement on a new universal agreement. So that was already decided, and the clock was ticking, and it had to be done. And everybody knew that this would be a very big job, very difficult job, because it had to be universal, which meant that every country had to be involved. It wasn't any longer simply action by the developed countries. It still recognized that the developed countries have to be in the lead, but it now included every country, and everybody knew that it was going to be difficult, and it would be a landmark moment when finally agreement would take place.
And so in the year prior to COP21, so there is a lot of work which has to be done in diplomatic terms, in substantive terms. I remember you came back out of retirement this year. I saw you the day you started your job at the UN for COP21. So what does a year of work entail when it comes to preparing such an event.
Well, it's
and yourself specifically as assisting the Secretary General.
Well, since my job was to assist the Secretary General, it certainly involved a great deal of travel this year, either traveling with the Secretary General for events worldwide where he was engaged, and I had to be there to support him in that process, or I had to go on my own on behalf of the Secretary General to visit ministers, leaders in different countries, and to engage in discussions to see how we can move the debate forward. So it involved quite a lot of travel, but it also involved quite a lot of engagement with other UN entities, heads of UN agencies, different parts of the UN system, but also different actors outside of the UN system. I'll just give you one example. We did a great deal of work with private finance. Because we feel very strongly that ultimately it is the private finance that will bring in the investment that we need for the solutions. But how do we engage that private finance worldwide? And so we had different activities with them. We brought them together. They made some pledges of how they were going to work on these issues. Then 6 months, 9 months later, we worked with them to see have they met those pledges. Then we analyzed the overall sector. So we have some picture now on how the private sector, the insurance companies, the institutional investors, the banks, how they're engaging with this issue of climate change.
And so when you were asked to come on board to assist Mr. Ban Ki-moon on the matter, what were the 2 or 3 key things which were going to be on your job description in terms of making this thing happen and making it happening in a successful fashion? What were the 2 or 3 items on your plate?
You know, the job description was very easy because it doesn't say very much. It says Assistant Secretary General.
It's an open-ended business.
So it was the details had to be figured out on the go, if you will. And you know, ultimately the Secretary General has many different activities where he needs support, and that was, of course, our job. It wasn't me; it was our team, because we have a team that was supporting him in this. But there are many different components to it. But if I can describe it with one expression, Secretary General's role is to connect the dots, to really connect different issues so that they actually come together at the end. And whether that's working at the political level or whether it's pushing a certain issue like the $100 billion commitment of the developed countries to developing countries, or whether it's engaging heads of states and government to see how they can best push the agenda forward. These are all different things, but ultimately for an agreement to happen, all of these things have to work, and when they come together, then you can have an agreement.
And you mentioned earlier, because you just gave a presentation at Rutgers, that from the start of his tenureship as a Secretary General, Mr. Ban Ki-moon has taken to his heart, or took to his heart, the issue of climate change.
Oh, absolutely.
In a way that nobody before him as a Secretary General had done.
Yes, indeed. I mean, he has taken up the climate change issue as a priority from the very first part of his tenure, his first year, and then he maintained it. And he maintained it over the years, and yes, there were some more and less intensive moments during those 9 years. This is his 10th year now, and he continues even after Paris, because there is still job to be done. We have to ratify the agreement, and we have to implement it, so he keeps pushing. But he has maintained this strong interest and this strong sense of priority for this issue. And there must be some personal reasons for that, but there are also very reasonable substantive and political reasons. You know, when you're Secretary General of the United Nations, you're involved in so many different things and so many complicated and difficult issues. Just think of Syria or Yemen, these political issues, so hard to address. And the United Nations keep working on those issues, and but it's sometimes very difficult to see how you actually succeed in those. But climate change is a little bit different. As difficult as it is, maybe the Secretary General felt from the beginning that this is one area where the United Nations can actually make a really serious difference. And I think he was right. I think the facts prove
Yeah.
us.
And so on the road to COP21, who were the key actors of the game? I mean, in this game, so the UN, of course, the SG, but in terms of member states, of course, France as a host country, but in terms of member states, in terms of the private sector, I mean, who were the key interlocutors of your day-to-day activity?
Before we come to the private sector, so one of the most important interlocutors is actually the head of the UNFCCC Secretariat, the Convention Secretariat that is based in Bonn. So in this case, the head is Christiana Figueres, and she has been the most important person actually, because she's the one who oversees the formal process of negotiations. And so I had very regular interactions with her on this issue, and a good interaction with her was also very important for our success. But apart from the formal UN process, there is also the various UN agencies like UN Environment Program, UN Development Program, the World Bank. These were all very, very important in different ways during the preparatory process. But in addition to that, as you say, the private sector has a key role, not just the private finance that I already mentioned, but also private sector in terms of the sector that will develop the energy technologies, the transport technologies, all the systems that we will need in order to actually address climate change and reduce emissions. And so we had considerable work program with different representatives of the private sector, of civil society, who are engaged in different partnerships on what we generally refer to as the action agenda.
And in terms of the member states, who were the key member states involved in the preparation of COP21, besides France, of course?
Well, France as the host country was clearly very important. You know, it's very difficult to say in the climate change context who is key, because you can say that there are some big countries, big emitters, China, United States, Russia. You know, these are big countries and big emitters. But then the president of Tonga, a small island in the Pacific, was extremely important, played a very, very important role in the negotiations and in bringing forward a view of a small country that is about to disappear because of climate change. So who is more important, Tonga or the United States? You know, so it's not a simple thing like that. But as always in these intergovernmental negotiations, the key countries are a combination of the big ones, the powerful ones, a number of the small ones that represent very different kind of situations, and then in addition to that, other countries that don't just represent themselves but represent some kind of a negotiation group or a regional group or some kind of. So we had, for example, in this case it was South Africa. It was important by its own size, but South Africa was the chair of the so-called Group of 77 and China, which is the 135 developing countries. So South Africa represented itself, but it also represented all the developing countries. So that was a very, very key position. There are others who represented the small islands. So you know there are different groups of countries, and those are ultimately the key countries that you want to work with.
And what about COP21 itself, which took place in Paris in early December? What were the key issues on the table, and what were the major achievements of the meeting, and can you tell us a bit about also the diplomatic culture at work in the context of this? Because you know a lot of people were around the table. It was really quite a bit of a circus, you mentioned.
Yes. So look. Basically, let's first talk about the outcomes of the Paris conference. I think what we have is a legally binding agreement that covers all countries. Very important that it covers all countries.
And what is the content of this agreement?
And in terms of content, first of all, it sets a much more ambitious long-term goal, not only to keep the temperature rise to well below 2 degrees, but also to consider moving toward 1.5 at some point, and that's much more ambitious than previous agreements. But also it adds to this the concept.
And this is a silly question probably, but I don't know much on the matter. So temperature is going to continue to rise.
Yes.
And so the goal is for us to simply slow down the rise of temperature.
Slow down the rise and to make sure that it doesn't go so it is maintained below this 2-degree level, well below, because it is generally thought that after the 2-degree threshold, there will be changes that will occur to ecosystems and to the economies that are irreversible. And that therefore it is generally felt that it should be kept below, but it is too high still. 2 degrees is still too high, and at the 2-degree level, many small island developing countries in the Pacific will disappear.
And once again, this is probably a silly question, but I mean, and not having temperature rising is not a reachable goal at all.
Well, no, because even if we stop all emissions today, which is very difficult, it was almost impossible to do, but even if we stopped all emissions today, there is already enough greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that will keep the temperature rising for
So we go for second best, if you will, which would be...
It's too late. It's too late to have zero temperature rise.
So
we have already risen. The global average is already 1 degree centigrade above previous.
So below 2 is our second best, if you will.
Yes, okay. So anyway, but just to come back to the long-term goal, because this is very important, that in addition to the temperature goal, there is also an indication that now countries recognize the need to peak emissions very soon, and then radically reduce afterwards, so that by the middle of this century we come to net zero emissions. That is to say, there will be a balance between emissions and sinks, and that's what's being referred to as net zero. And that is a very strong and very clear signal of the direction the world needs to go.
So that's the goal for 2050. So we have basically 35 years to make it happen.
You can put it that way. Yes.
And then the argument which has been reached in Paris is one of the devices, one of the tools on the way for this goal to be reached, right?
One of the goals.
One of the tools or devices for this reach to be goal.
Yeah.
For this goal to be reached.
Yeah. Look, the devices are basically mitigation options that countries have at their disposal, and they have put forward proposals. Each country has brought their national climate plan forward. 188 countries have done that by the time of the Paris conference, which is fantastic. It means basically all countries have almost all the countries have done that, and they show within those national plans the individual, how each individual country is going to try to put together emission reduction and adaptation strategies in order to reach these objectives. Now we know that collectively these national plans will not give us the less than 2 degree path. We know that. But it's if they are all implemented, it should give us about 3 degrees, which is much better than business as usual. So we know we're going in the right direction, but we also know that we have some more
So
work
you
to
don't
do.
envision having the below 2 degrees being reached?
Well, we do envisage. That's why. But you know, this is about the temperature rise by the end of the century. So temperature will rise slowly, and we want to make sure that it doesn't rise above that level. And there will be regular, and this is a very important outcome of the Paris conference, there will be regular meetings every 5 years to take stock of where we are in terms of the temperature objective and in terms of what countries are doing. And if it's not enough, then everybody will need to go back and come back with new plans that cannot be weaker than the existing plans. So it always has to be just in one direction of always more and more ambitious plans.
And so you talked about adaptation, you talked about mitigation. What are the other keywords in terms of the outcomes of this?
There is also a very important part of the agreement is a mechanism, a transparency and reporting mechanism, because we need to know what's going on in a credible way. So we have the principles of that adopted. Some of the practical details will still need to be worked out afterwards. And there is also support mechanisms to the developing countries, in particular financial capacity building and technology support. These are also part of the agreement.
In the weeks prior to COP21, you were in Budapest and you talked about what would be the right benchmarks for COP21 being a success. Can you remind us what were these benchmarks and how you feel they have been met by COP21?
Yeah, we put together like 5 key areas where we felt that if those are met, then we can consider Paris a success. And the first one was that the conference, the results of the conference have to send a clear long-term signal to the markets that this is the direction that we're going. And I think, as explained with the long-term goal, that is going to happen. Of course, it will take some time before we can ascertain that really that signal has gone to the markets that way. But the initial responses from media and from some of the business sectors is very positive. The second one was that it should be flexible. Flexible in the sense that it would recognize that developed countries still have to take the lead, because they're the ones who are responsible for most historical emissions. But at the same time, there should be a recognition that developing countries also have an increasing responsibility to act because of their own increasing emissions and economic power. And that is being recognized in a number of parts of this agreement. Then the third point was also that it should be based on solidarity. Because there are many countries who did not cause climate change who are being impacted by that. And what has happened in the decisions relating to support, financial support, technological support, but also the call for adaptation goal and elements like that, I think we've done fairly well on that as well. Then the next point we made was that it should be credible. Credibility is key, and there we have the transparency and reporting mechanisms, which I think will get us that credibility. And finally, what we said was that it has to include, well, the overall package has to take us to less than 2 degrees centigrade,
yes. Mm-hmm.
And which I think we will only be able to measure later, but I think the indications are that it's going to go in that direction.
You also mentioned that the document itself is a bit complex in terms of reading and you seem to be quite satisfied with the fact that the governments have been very much engaged in the process leading to COP21 and in COP21 itself. So somehow now governments, countries are more on board than they have been perhaps in the past. What about public opinion? Because if the document itself is very, very complex and perhaps not fulfilling the demands of PR, if you will, so how do you, if there is a gap, first of all, and how do you bridge the gap in terms of having beyond governments people being made aware and engaged in?
The document is an intergovernmental treaty. It's an agreement, and in that sense it is legal language and it's complicated, and that's what these documents tend to be. I think there's no way around that. That's the way these documents, most of them tend to be. I think what's important is how one communicates this for the broader public and the broader set of actors, whether it's private sector, civil society, and so on. And I think that's why it's so important to have interviews like this one, because it's in these kinds of events that we can explain in using perhaps more normal language of what these agreements are all about. And there will have to be done. We will have to do a lot more of this kind of communication, written, oral, and other ways to explain what this agreement is all about. What it's not about, yes. and how it will be implemented by the different actors.
You mentioned earlier that more than 40,000 people were part and parcel of COP20. So how do you keep under control a place with 40,000 people engaged in the negotiation, or at least discussion process?
Well, with difficulty. That's the short answer.
What is the secret ingredient to make it happen?
First, there's a differentiation, but there are different kinds of actors. There is regular delegates, and there are observers, there are media, there's intergovernmental organizations. So there are different kinds of actors, and they all come and do different things. But the reality is that within the conference center of this nature, there is very high level of security, badges. You can only go to certain places depending on the kind of badges that you have. Then there are special events when there are special badges. Mr. Fabius, quite a lot, and his team, because these things need a lot of strategizing and engagement from all of these actors. And just to give you one example, the role of the head of states and government, that's a very key issue, and that's an area where the Secretary General has a very specific role, and he engaged with the President Hollande and also President Humala of Peru, the previous presidency of the COP, to work out what is the best way to keep the heads of states engaged and how they can be most helpful in achieving success.
And you also mentioned, which I thought was interesting, that the terrorist attack which took place a few days prior to the conference had, regardless of the fact that they were themselves very tragic, of course, had a positive impact on the atmosphere, on the diplomatic atmosphere of the conference, in the sense that people wanted to really show that they were committed, that they wanted to have something happening, and so on.
Yes, I think this is how I felt, that really countries came, and they all came in very big numbers, and the heads of state, there were 150 heads of states.
So there was an added sense of seriousness and commitment?
Yes, yes, and they showed that on the first day, that this was really solidarity with France, not just as co-president, but going beyond at the time of this terrible thing that happened, that there was solidarity from all the nations, and I think it was very, at the end it came as a very positive force.
Yeah. So now we are in January 2016, so we are in the immediate aftermath of COP21. So what is the way forward? What are the next big steps for the coming year, for the coming 2 years?
Well, the first big step will happen on the 22nd of April, because that's when the agreement will be opened for formal signatures at the United Nations, because this is a legal requirement for an international legal instrument, and the depository for the instrument is the Secretary General of the United Nations. So there will be a big event at head of state level, where there will be many heads of states and government who will come to New York to formally sign the document. And then it will be open for ratification.
And what is the horizon of ratification? Do you think it will end up being ratified by when?
Well, that's hard to say. What we know is that we need 55 countries. There's a double trigger. We need 55 countries and 55% of the total emissions to be reached. The 55% of the emissions can be reached by 6 countries.
Yes.
Okay.
The biggest.
The big six emitters. So if
and the big 6 are.
Well, let me see if I get this right.
But U.S., China.
U.S., China, Russia, Japan. I think something, I don't want to say the wrong things because there are a few really big ones, and then it kind of tapers down to 2 and 1%. Anyway, and then we need 55 countries also in total. So we need both numbers and percentage.
Certain level.
It is conceivable that it could be ratified, that enough ratifications could come in within about a year to have it enter into force. It is possible.
And then you mentioned this afternoon the date of 2020.
Yeah,
so what happens in 2020?
Well, it is the national plans are meant to be from 2020 on. Okay, so that's when the real thing starts. But before the 2020, a lot of detail still has to be worked out, because the Paris Agreement includes a lot of the principles of how the mechanism should operate, but that has to be worked out in detail.
So it's really in 2020 that things will get started in terms of being put to
the
work.
Formality of the agreement. But at the same time, there's a desire by countries that we can't wait till 2020, and it's a bit too late to wait until 2020. So action will also need to take place before 2020, and that's referred to as pre-2020 action. And so there is encouragement for engagement at various levels by countries, by the private sector, to do things that will actually reduce them, not just to reduce emissions as early as possible, but also we need to prepare for 2020. 2020 is only a few years from now. It's already 2016, so it's not that far ahead. So there will be a summit of investors in the United Nations tomorrow, and one of the messages we're carrying there is that you can't wait till 2020 to start your investment plans. You have to start it now. It's already a bit too late for that. So there is a lot to do before 2020
for the years to come.
to both be ready for the formal agreement to be actionable, but also to simply do the things that we have to do all the time: reduce emissions, adapt to climate change, advance international cooperation. All of those things need to be done every day.
This week is your last week as a UN official. It's not a state secret that you are going back to Geneva. So, and you have been working on and off at the UN for many years. How do you reflect on your time at the UN, and how do you see the debates on climate change having evolved over the years. I mean, you know, when you started 20 years ago, it must have been very different from what it is, both when it comes to climate change and the UN. So as a professional committed to the UN, to its ideals, ideas, and so on, so how do you reflect on your career and on the evolution of the UN in general and on the evolution on issues of climate change?
That's a difficult question. But first of all, a correction, I started 30 years ago.
Oh, 30 years. You look so young.
So it's not 20. But I think one thing I haven't said, but I think it's really important in this context, that the Paris Agreement is actually a huge triumph for multilateralism. Mm-hmm. After the complicated ending of the Copenhagen Conference and some other challenging situations, many people were saying, well, the UN is no good for these things. We have to find some other way of solving international problems. And
like the G2.
You know, but you know, the reality is that you do need the United Nations. You need it more than ever before, and the success in Paris has shown that actually multilateral approach can work, and it does work. So this has given a bit of a new lease of life on multilateralism, which was very much needed.
Yes.
And I personally think that we need the United Nations more than ever before, and we need to make it stronger, not weaker. And there are many areas where we need to improve the United Nations. I've been working on many of those things for the last few years. You've done that too in part of your life. And we know from inside that there are many things that can be improved and need to be improved. But frankly, without the United Nations, we'll be a really troubled world. So I think I'm more convinced than ever that we need this. In terms of climate change, things have moved forward. I think it's, you know, the response is evolving because the world is evolving, and I think this is just as much as the Kyoto Protocol was the right thing to do back at that time in the 1990s. This is the right thing to do in today's realities with the increasing economic activity and emissions in many of the developing countries. So I think this is good. Overall development is fine, but I know we have a long way to go.
Are you going to continue to work on climate change in your new capacity, in your new life?
I don't know yet. This is we're working on this, but I really don't see how I can leave climate change completely off my radar screen.
Very good. Sir, thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for the interview. So we were having a conversation with Mr. János Pastor, Assistant Secretary General on Climate Change for the United Nations. I am Jean-Marc Coicot from Rutgers University. I thank you for listening, and we hope to see you next time. Thank you.